The autumn air in Boston carried a crisp chill that morning, the kind that made people pull their coats tighter as they hurried along the cobblestone streets near Harvard University. Golden leaves scattered across the pathways, dancing in the wind before settling against the historic brick buildings that had stood for centuries. The prestigious campus buzzed with its usual energy. Students rushing between classes, professors engaged in heated debates, and tourists snapping photos of the iconic ivy-covered walls. But before we continue with this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next powerful story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's get back to the story. Inside Emerson Hall, Professor Margaret Chen was preparing for her advanced business ethics seminar. At 52, she had spent nearly 3 decades teaching at Harvard, her reputation built on intellectual rigor and an uncanny ability to spot potential in the most unlikely students. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her sharp eyes missed nothing as students filtered into the lecture hall. The room gradually filled with the usual crowd: children of senators, tech executives, and old money families. These students wore their privilege like a second skin, designer backpacks casually tossed on mahogany desks, the latest smartphones glinting under the fluorescent lights. They spoke in the confident tones of those who had never truly struggled, discussing weekend trips to the Hamptons and summer internships at Goldman Sachs that had been secured through family connections. Then he walked in. Khalid Al-Rashid moved quietly to an empty seat near the back. He wore simple clothes, a plain gray hoodie, faded jeans, and worn sneakers that had clearly seen better days. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and he carried a backpack that looked like it had survived several years of hard use. At 28, he was older than most students in the room, and there was something in his dark eyes, a depth, a weariness, that spoke of experiences far beyond the ivory tower walls. "Look who decided to show up," whispered Brandon Whitmore III to his friend Ashley Vanderberg. Brandon came from a family of real estate moguls, his father's name on buildings across Manhattan. His smirk was automatic, practiced, probably on some diversity scholarship. Ashley stifled a laugh behind her perfectly manicured hand. "My dad says they're letting in anyone these days. Standards have really dropped." Their friend, Connor Morrison, leaned in, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Do you think he even speaks English? Maybe we should talk slower for him." The 3 of them snickered, not bothering to lower their voices. Several other students glanced over, some looking uncomfortable, others joining in the quiet mockery. Khalid sat down, pulling out a simple notebook and a pen. He didn't react to their comments, didn't even seem to acknowledge them. His expression remained neutral, almost meditative. Professor Chen entered through the side door, her sharp gaze immediately sweeping the room. She caught the tail end of the whispered conversation, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing yet. She had learned over the years that some lessons needed to unfold naturally. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice carrying easily through the lecture hall. "Today, we're going to discuss something that many of you will face in your future careers: the ethics of wealth accumulation and corporate responsibility in developing nations. Specifically, we'll examine the oil and technology industries in the Middle East." Brandon leaned back in his chair, the epitome of casual arrogance. "Professor Chen, with all due respect, isn't the Middle East just a bunch of countries sitting on oil? I mean, how much business ethics can there be when you're basically winning the geographic lottery?" Several students chuckled. Professor Chen's expression remained unchanged. "An interesting perspective, Mr. Whitmore. Perhaps overly simplistic, but we'll explore that." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation. "Let's start with a case study. In the early 2000s, a young entrepreneur in Dubai noticed that while his country had abundant oil wealth, it lacked technological infrastructure. Most systems were outdated, inefficient. So at 23 years old, with only $50,000 borrowed from family members, he started a tech company focused on modernizing oil field operations using AI and data analytics. The room settled into focus. Professor Chen continued, her voice measured and precise. Within 5 years, his company had revolutionized how oil extraction was managed in the UAE. But here's where it gets interesting. He didn't just pocket the profits. He established a foundation that built schools in rural areas, funded scholarships for underprivileged children, and created job training programs for refugees. By his 30th birthday, his company was valued at over $2 billion, and he had put more than $300 million into educational initiatives. Ashley raised her hand, her tone skeptical. That's a nice story, Professor. But how do we know it's not just public relations? Rich people in those countries probably have to look good for Western investors, right? Another interesting assumption, Professor Chen replied, her eyes gleaming with something that might have been satisfaction. What makes you think this person was concerned about Western investors, Ms. Vanderberg? Well, Ashley faltered slightly. That's where the real money is, isn't it? American and European markets? From the back of the room, Khalid finally spoke. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying a subtle accent that marked him as a non-native speaker, though his English was impeccable. Actually, the Gulf states have some of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority alone manages over $900 billion. They're not exactly desperate for Western validation. The room turned to look at him. Brandon's smirk widened. "Oh, so you do speak," Brandon said loudly. "Tell me, how would you know about sovereign wealth funds? Did you read about them at the public library back home?" Connor jumped in, emboldened. "Yeah, where exactly are you from anyway? I'm guessing you're here on some charity program?" The cruelty in the room became palpable. Several students shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Khalid's expression didn't change. He simply looked at Brandon with those deep, unreadable eyes. "I'm from Dubai," he said quietly, "and I'm here because I want to learn." "Dubai?" Ashley laughed. "So your family probably has some oil money then. Must be nice to buy your way into Harvard." Professor Chen's voice cut through the room like a blade. "That's enough." The authority in her tone silenced everyone immediately. She walked slowly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. "Ms. Vanderberg, Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Morrison, you've just demonstrated exactly the kind of ignorant prejudice that destroys business relationships and international partnerships. You've made assumptions based on appearance, accent, and origin. You've displayed the exact kind of arrogance that gets American companies banned from foreign markets." Brandon's smirk faded slightly, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Professor, you were just revealing your profound ignorance," she interrupted, her voice ice-cold. "Khalid, would you mind standing up for a moment?" Khalid hesitated, then stood slowly. The entire class was now completely silent, sensing that something significant was happening. Professor Chen turned to face the room. "I want to introduce you all properly to your classmate. This is Khalid Al-Rashid. Perhaps the name sounds familiar? No?" She paused, letting the silence build. "Khalid is the founder and former CEO of Nextech Solutions, the company I was just describing, the one that revolutionized oil field technology across the Middle East, the one valued at over $3 billion as of last month." The color drained from Brandon's face. Ashley's mouth opened slightly in shock. Around the room, students began frantically Googling on their phones, whispers of recognition rippling through the lecture hall. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "That's him. That's actually him," Professor Chen continued, relentless. "Khalid sold his majority stake in Nextech last year for $2.1 billion. He donated over half of that to his educational foundation. He's currently funding the education of over 10,000 children across the Middle East and North Africa. He's been featured in Forbes Time magazine and was named one of the world's most influential tech entrepreneurs under 35 by MIT Technology Review." The room was absolutely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. "So, when you ask if he's here on a charity program, Ms. Vanderberg, the answer is no. He's here because after building one of the most successful tech companies in the Middle East, he decided to pursue a graduate degree to better understand Western business systems. He's here because he wants to build bridges between cultures. He's here because, unlike many of you, he earned his place not through family connections or legacy admissions, but through actual achievement." Brandon had gone pale. Ashley was staring at her desk, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Connor looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Khalid remained standing, his expression still calm, almost gentle. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction at seeing his tormentors humiliated. If anything, he looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Professor Chen," he said quietly, "I appreciate the introduction, but I really do just want to be a regular student here. The past doesn't matter. I'm here to learn, like everyone else." Professor Chen's severe expression softened slightly as she looked at him. "Sit down, Khalid, and thank you for your grace, which I note is significantly more developed than your classmates." As Khalid sat, Professor Chen turned back to the class. "Here's what I want you all to understand. The world is changing faster than you realize. The assumptions your parents held, the prejudices they passed down, the automatic superiority they felt, none of that serves you anymore. China, India, the Gulf states, Africa. These regions are producing innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders who will shape the next century. And if you walk into your future careers with the same narrow-minded arrogance you displayed today, you will fail spectacularly. She let that sink in before continuing. Brandon, Ashley, Connor, I want 5,000-word papers on my desk by Monday morning analyzing the economic and technological development of the UAE since 2000. Include sections on sovereign wealth fund management, technological infrastructure investment, and the role of entrepreneurs in diversifying Gulf economies. Sources must include at least 10 academic journals and 3 books. No Wikipedia. The 3 students nodded miserably, not daring to protest. As for the rest of you, Professor Chen said, addressing the entire class, I want you to think about what you witnessed here today. How quickly you were willing to judge someone based on superficial factors. How easily you fell into tribal thinking. How readily you assumed that worth equals appearance, or that accent equals intelligence. These are the biases that will cost you millions in lost deals, that will tank your companies, that will make you obsolete in a global marketplace. After class, as students filed out in subdued silence, Brandon approached Khalid hesitantly. His earlier swagger was completely gone, replaced by genuine mortification. Hey, Khalid? His voice cracked slightly. I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry. What I said was completely out of line. I was being an ignorant jerk and I have no excuse. Khalid looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. Ashley and Connor had followed Brandon, both looking equally ashamed. We're sorry too, Ashley said quietly. I can't believe how horrible we were. You must think we're terrible people. Khalid's expression softened. I don't think you're terrible. I think you're young people who've been raised in a certain environment with certain assumptions. The fact that you're apologizing means you're capable of growth. That's what matters. Connor shook his head in disbelief. Man, if someone treated me like that, I don't think I could be this cool about it. Why are you being so nice? Khalid was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Because I know what it's like to be judged unfairly. When I first started my company, Western investors wouldn't even take meetings with me. They assumed I was just another rich kid playing with daddy's money. They didn't know that my father was a taxi driver who worked 16-hour days so I could go to university. They didn't know that the $50,000 I borrowed came from my entire extended family pooling their savings. They just saw my name, my accent, my appearance, and made their assumptions. He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. So yes, I was successful, but I remember every closed door, every dismissive email, every meeting where people talked down to me like I was stupid. I remember how that felt, and I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to respond to that kind of treatment with something other than anger, I would, because anger just perpetuates the cycle. Brandon looked like he might cry. I don't know what to say. You're a better person than I am. I'm just a person trying to be better than I was yesterday, Khalid replied. Same as anyone. Professor Chen had been watching this exchange from her office door. She approached the small group, her expression unreadable. Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Vanderberg, Mr. Morrison, you still have those papers due Monday. Don't think this moment of reflection gets you off the hook. No, ma'am, they chorused. After they left, Professor Chen turned to Khalid. Walk with me? They strolled through the quiet hallways of Emerson Hall, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. Outside the windows, the autumn afternoon was fading into evening, the sky turning deep gold and purple. You handled that remarkably well, Professor Chen said. I've been teaching for 30 years, and I've never seen a student respond to that kind of humiliation with such grace. Khalid shrugged. What would anger accomplish? They're kids who've never been challenged on their worldview. Today they got challenged. Maybe they'll grow from it. Maybe they won't. But responding with hostility would only confirm their biases. You're wise beyond your years, she observed. Though I suppose building a billion-dollar company by 30 will do that. They reached her office, and she gestured for him to enter. The walls were lined with books, diplomas from 3 different universities, and photos of Professor Chen, with various dignitaries and business leaders. Can I ask you something, Khalid? She settled into her chair behind her desk. Why are you really here? You've already achieved more than most people accomplish in a lifetime. You could be anywhere in the world doing anything. Why Harvard? Why now? Khalid sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. Because success without understanding is hollow. I built my company. Yes. I made money. Yes. But in the process, I realized how little I understood about the systems I was working within, the global financial structures, the political dynamics, the cultural currents that shape how business actually gets done. I learned all of that through trial and error, through making mistakes, through sometimes failing spectacularly before figuring it out. He leaned forward, his passion evident now. "I want my foundation to do more than just build schools. I want to create the next generation of entrepreneurs across the Middle East and North Africa. But to do that effectively, I need to understand Western business education, Western thinking patterns, Western institutions, not to copy them blindly, but to understand them deeply enough to create bridges, to build programs that work with both cultures, not against them." Professor Chen nodded slowly. "And when you go back, what's the long-term plan?" "I want to start a university," Khalid said simply. "A place that combines the best of Eastern and Western business education, where students from Dubai can learn alongside students from Detroit, where the focus is on creating ethical, globally minded entrepreneurs who see business as a tool for solving problems, not just accumulating wealth, where someone's background doesn't matter, only their potential, their ethics, their vision." He smiled slightly. "Ambitious, I know, maybe too ambitious. But I figure if I could build a tech company from nothing, maybe I can build this too." Professor Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying him. "You know what strikes me most about you, Khalid? It's not your success, impressive as that is. It's your humility. In all my years teaching, I've encountered maybe a handful of truly successful people who remained genuinely humble. Most let their achievements inflate their egos until they can barely fit through a doorway. But you," she shook her head slightly, "you still see yourself as a student. That's rare. That's precious." Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened in Professor Chen's class. Brandon, Ashley, and Connor didn't just complete their assigned papers. They threw themselves into the work with genuine curiosity. Brandon discovered a fascination with Gulf economic development that led him to completely reconsider his career plans. Ashley began researching refugee education programs in the Middle East and started corresponding with one of the schools Khalid's foundation had built. Connor changed his entire thesis topic to focus on cross-cultural business partnerships. But the transformation went deeper than 3 chastened students. Khalid became a quiet catalyst for change in the entire program. He never flaunted his background or his wealth. He continued to dress simply, to speak modestly, to listen more than he talked. But when he did contribute to discussions, his insights, drawn from real-world experience building a company across multiple countries, navigating complex political situations, managing cross-cultural teams, brought an authenticity that theory alone could never match. Other students began seeking him out, not because he was wealthy, but because he was genuinely interested in their ideas, generous with his time, and willing to share hard-earned lessons without pretense. Study groups formed around him, international students, who often felt marginalized in the predominantly American environment, found in Khalid someone who understood their perspective. One evening, about 6 weeks into the semester, a group of students, including Brandon, Ashley, and Connor, organized an informal gathering at a Cambridge coffee shop. Khalid had been invited but arrived late, apologizing profusely because he'd been on a video call with his foundation's directors in Dubai. "Everything okay?" Brandon asked, genuine concern in his voice. Their relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship, though Brandon clearly still felt he was working off a debt of shame. "Actually, yes," Khalid said, ordering a simple coffee. "We just got approval to open 3 new schools in Jordan. Refugee camps where there's been no formal education available for years. We're going to serve about 2,000 kids. That's incredible," Ashley said. She'd been following the foundation's work closely. "How do you handle the logistics? Getting teachers, supplies, dealing with the political complications?" Khalid launched into an explanation of the challenges, negotiating with multiple government agencies, recruiting teachers willing to work in difficult conditions, adapting curriculum to students who'd missed years of education, dealing with trauma and disruption. He spoke matter-of-factly, without false modesty, but also without self-aggrandizement, treating it as simply a problem-solving exercise. Connor, who had been listening intently, finally spoke up. "Can I ask you something personal? And you can totally tell me to mind my own business." "Of course," Khalid replied. "That first day of class, When we said all those things," Connor's voice was heavy with lingering guilt. "You didn't react at all. You just sat there, totally calm." "How? I mean, if you'd called us out right then, told us who you were, we would have looked like the biggest idiots on earth. Why didn't you?" The group went quiet, everyone waiting for Khalid's answer. He was silent for a moment, staring into his coffee. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything," he finally said. "If I'd pulled the 'do you know who I am' card, sure. You would have apologized immediately, but it would have been because of my wealth, my status. Not because you actually understood why what you were saying was wrong. You would have been deferential to the billionaire. but you still would have looked down on the guy in the cheap hoodie. He looked up, meeting their eyes. Professor Chen's approach, letting you make your assumptions, then revealing the truth, forced you to confront your own biases. Not just about me, but about how you judge people in general. That's a lesson that might actually stick. That might actually change how you think. It definitely changed me, Brandon admitted. I've been thinking a lot about how I was raised, the assumptions I just absorbed without questioning them. My dad's whole worldview is based on this idea that we're better than other people because we have money, because we're American, because we're white, and I just accepted that, never questioned it, until that day. He looked embarrassed, but continued. I've started noticing how many opportunities I've gotten just because of my last name, internships I didn't deserve, acceptances to schools where my grades were borderline, people taking my calls just because they know my father. And it's not that I don't want to take advantage of those opportunities. I'm not stupid, but now I at least recognize them for what they are, unearned advantages. And maybe that means I have a responsibility to, I don't know, pay it forward somehow. Ashley nodded emphatically. That's exactly it. I've been researching education inequality, and the statistics are staggering. Kids in rural America, inner cities, refugee camps, developing countries, millions of kids with the same potential as us, or more, who'll never get a chance just because of where they were born. It's not fair, and we're not making it more fair by pretending everyone has equal opportunities. A young woman named Priya, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. She was from Mumbai, one of the international students who'd felt particularly isolated in the program. Can I tell you all something? She said softly. That first day, when you were making fun of Khalid, I wanted to say something, but I didn't because she trailed off, then forced herself to continue, because I was afraid you'd turn that mockery on me. I have an accent too. My clothes aren't as expensive. My family isn't wealthy by American standards. And I've been dealing with little microaggressions since I got here. People talking slowly at me like I'm stupid. Others asking me to translate my thoughts into simpler English. Someone once asking if we had cars in India. She looked directly at Brandon, Ashley, and Connor. I'm not trying to make you feel worse. You've clearly learned from what happened. But I wanted you to know that what you did that day wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that a lot of us international students experience constantly, and it's exhausting. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people actually thinking, actually processing. I'm sorry, Brandon said finally. To you, and to everyone else we've made feel that way. And I know sorry isn't enough, but I want you to know I'm trying to do better. Khalid smiled at Priya. Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to be vulnerable like that, especially when you're worried about how people will react. The conversation continued for hours, ranging across topics: cultural differences, economic inequality, the responsibility of privilege, the challenges of cross-cultural communication. It was the kind of deep, honest discussion that rarely happens in classroom settings, where vulnerability is often seen as weakness and admitting ignorance feels dangerous. As the evening wound down and the group prepared to leave, Professor Chen appeared at the coffee shop, apparently by coincidence. But Khalid suspected there were no coincidences where Professor Chen was concerned. Well, she said, surveying the diverse group gathered around the table. This looks like exactly the kind of informal learning I hoped would happen in my course. Professor Chen? Ashley stood up. Would you like to join us? Thank you. But no. I just stopped by for a coffee to go, she ordered at the counter, then turned back to the group. Though I am curious, what profound truths have you all discovered this evening? Brandon laughed, a genuine sound without his earlier arrogance. Mostly that we don't know nearly as much as we thought we did. Ah, Professor Chen said, accepting her coffee from the barista. Then you're finally getting a real education. When students arrive at Harvard, they usually think they know everything. The truly educated leave knowing that they know almost nothing, but now they know how to learn, how to question, how to grow. That's the real value of this place. She paused at the door. Khalid, walk me out. Outside, the November air had turned sharp and cold. Cambridge was beautiful at night. The historic buildings lit softly, students hurrying past in small groups, their breath visible in the cold air. You're doing good work in there, Professor Chen said as they walked slowly down the street. Those students have changed more in 6 weeks than most do in 4 years. They were ready to change, Khalid replied. They just needed the right catalyst. Don't be so modest. You're teaching them something universities struggle to teach: empathy, humility, the understanding that wealth and status are accidents of birth, not measures of worth. She stopped walking, turning to face him. Can I tell you a story? Of course. When I was 25, I was working at a consulting firm in New York, one of the most prestigious in the world, or so I thought. I was the only Asian woman in my cohort, and I worked twice as hard as everyone else to prove I deserved to be there. One day, we were working on a major deal with a Japanese manufacturing company. I spoke Japanese. My parents were from Hong Kong, but I'd studied in Tokyo. I understood the culture, the business etiquette, the nuances that my colleagues were completely missing. Professor Chen's voice grew harder. In the meeting, the senior partner made a joke at the Japanese executive's expense. Something about their English, their formality. I saw their faces close off, saw the deal start to slip away, and I said nothing. I was so desperate to fit in, to be accepted by my American colleagues, that I betrayed my own understanding, my own integrity. She looked at Khalid directly. We lost that deal, a $100 million contract gone because of ignorance and arrogance. And I learned two things that day. First, that fitting in is worthless if you have to sacrifice your principles to do it. Second, that real leadership means having the courage to speak up when others are making mistakes. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when you might face consequences. That's why you were so hard on Brandon and the others, Khalid said quietly. You were teaching them the lesson you had to learn the hard way. Exactly, and you reinforced that lesson with your response, with your grace, your refusal to let their ignorance make you bitter. You showed them an alternative path. She smiled slightly. Though I have to admit, I was worried you might be too forgiving, that you'd let them off too easily. Khalid shook his head. There's a difference between forgiveness and excusing bad behavior. I forgave them because holding on to anger would only hurt me, but I didn't excuse what they did. And more importantly, they didn't excuse themselves. That's why I think the lesson will stick. They had reached the edge of campus. In the distance, the Harvard yard was quiet. A few students still visible, studying on benches despite the cold. What you said about starting a university, Professor Chen said. Were you serious about that? Completely. Then when you do, I want to be involved. As a consultant, an advisor, a professor, whatever you need. Because what you're envisioning, a truly global institution that bridges cultures instead of privileging one over others, that's the future of education. If we don't adapt, we'll become obsolete. Khalid looked surprised. You'd leave Harvard? I'm not talking about leaving. I'm talking about helping you build something that Harvard can learn from. Competition breeds excellence, and Harvard has gotten comfortable. A little disruption would do us good. Her eyes gleamed with something that looked like excitement. Besides, I'm 60 next year. I'm not ready to retire, but I am ready for a new challenge. Your vision excites me in a way nothing has for a long time. They shook hands, and as Professor Chen walked away, Khalid stood for a moment in the cold night air, looking up at the stars barely visible through the light pollution. He thought about his father, driving that taxi through Dubai's streets, saving every dirham. He thought about his mother, who cleaned houses to pay for his school supplies. He thought about the moment he'd signed his first major contract, knowing his parents would never have to work again. And he thought about that first day in Professor Chen's class, sitting in the back row while students mocked him. How easy it would have been to be angry, to let that anger harden into bitterness, to use his wealth and power to make them feel small the way they'd tried to make him feel small. But that would have been a waste. Anger was easy. Revenge was easy. What was hard, what actually mattered, was transformation, taking moments of conflict and turning them into opportunities for growth, not just for others, but for himself. His phone buzzed with a message from Brandon. Hey man, just wanted to say thanks for tonight. You're helping me become a better person. That sounds cheesy, but it's true. Khalid smiled and typed back. You're doing the work, not me. Keep going. As he walked back to his small apartment off campus, he'd rented a modest place, despite being able to buy any property in Cambridge he wanted. Khalid reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. From a taxi driver's son in Dubai, to a billionaire tech entrepreneur, to a Harvard graduate student. From being mocked in a lecture hall to becoming a catalyst for transformation. The truth was, he'd known exactly what would happen that first day. He'd heard the whispers, seen the smirks. He'd been there before many times. He could have walked in wearing an expensive suit, could have introduced himself with his full credentials, could have forestalled the mockery before it began, but that wouldn't have taught anyone anything, including himself. Because every time he faced that kind of prejudice and chose grace over anger, chose education over retaliation, chose hope over bitterness, he was reinforcing his own values. He was becoming the person he wanted to be, not despite his wealth and success, but because of how he chose to use them. The semester continued. Brandon, Ashley, and Connor didn't just complete their transformation. They became advocates, using their privilege to call out the same behaviors in others that they'd once embodied. Priya found her voice, speaking up in class discussions with a confidence that attracted other international students who'd felt marginalized. The entire dynamic of Professor Chen's seminar shifted, becoming a space where genuine dialogue across cultures and perspectives could happen. And Khalid continued to be Khalid, the quiet student in simple clothes, listening more than talking, asking questions that challenged assumptions, sharing stories from his experience without pretension. He never forgot that first day, but he didn't dwell on it either. It was simply a moment, one of countless moments that shape who we become. 3 years later, when Khalid stood at the opening ceremony of the Dubai Institute for Global Business, his vision of a truly international business school finally realized. Professor Chen was on stage beside him as Dean of Faculty. Brandon was there too, having spent his summers working with Khalid's educational foundation and now committed to a career in international development. Ashley had joined the foundation full-time, overseeing refugee education programs. Connor was in the audience, having written a book about cross-cultural business practices that drew heavily on what he'd learned from Khalid. As Khalid looked out at the crowd, students from 27 countries, representing every inhabited continent, he remembered that autumn morning in Boston, remembered the mockery, the assumptions, the casual cruelty of young people who'd never been challenged. He remembered Professor Chen's voice, cutting through the silence. "I want to introduce you all properly to your classmate." And he remembered thinking, in that moment, that this was why he'd come to Harvard, not to prove himself to others. He'd already done that, but to be part of moments like this, where assumptions could be shattered, where minds could be opened, where transformation was possible. Because in the end, that was the real measure of success. Not the billions in his bank account, not the companies he'd built, not the awards he'd won, but the minds he'd helped to open, the bridges he'd helped to build, the young people he'd inspired to be better than they thought they could be. The Arab billionaire had been laughed at by a group of students, but in the end, those students hadn't exposed him. He'd freed them. And in the process, they'd all learned the most important lesson of all, that our prejudices limit us far more than they limit those we judge, and that grace in the face of mockery is the truest form of strength. As he began his opening speech, Khalid looked at Professor Chen and smiled. She smiled back, knowing without words what he was thinking. Some lessons are only learned through experience. Some truths can only be discovered through humility. And some transformations only happen when we're brave enough to see past the surface, to question our assumptions, to recognize that worth has nothing to do with wealth, power has nothing to do with privilege, and that true education begins the moment we admit we don't know everything. The story that had started with mockery in a Boston lecture hall had ended with hope in a Dubai auditorium, and somewhere in between, everyone involved had learned to be a little more human. That, Khalid thought as he spoke to the assembled students, was worth more than all the billions in the world.